Like most Ritilian planets, Jormungandr was of a temperate climate. Dry and arid, the reptilian species had emerged from its sand-covered masses and entered the galaxy about 3,000 years ago. A moderately influential race with a penchant for exploration, they were well known for their vast network of small colonies scattered around the galaxy, taking warmer locations that most species couldn't handle. Zantari stood in the embassy that hung in the sky, the giant floating structure hovering over the great capital city below. Their taken form was a small, cream-colored bipedal reptile, dressed in airy white robes, to deal with the heat that even this room suffered from. They looked out of the large glass window that offered an enticing view of the entire sunlit land beneath them. While the Ritilians had long since left the sand dunes behind in favor of a bustling metropolis, the cultural impact of such a start to their species was clearly evident in their architecture. Every structure faced the winds with sharp edges designed to cut against the sandstorms of old, a sea of matte white buildings more akin to sails stretching as far as the eyes could see. Thousands of different buildings of varying sizes, from tall skyscrapers that reached to the heavens to older, smaller single-family dwellings that almost seemed to erupt from the ground. The Gurlin had seen this before. The Ritilians were a known quantity, properly catalogued with politely maintained diplomatic relations. What interested them more were the changes. The impact of the Terrans since Zantari had been here last was clear, almost strikingly so. The square buildings that had been created by the primates stood out like a sore thumb, the small structures scattered around the city showing the impact the Terrans had had on the reptilian species over a mere 70 years. Zantari was easily able to change their visual acuity to watch the people as they moved around the streets below them, meaning they got their first real-life glimpse of the cute little primates known as Terrans. They were a minority, but a noticeable one, as they wandered around the city streets, interacting with the residents of this planet, and sunbathing in the various parks and pools that were scattered in between the built-up city. Even watching them was adorable, the little munchkins getting into all kinds of trouble as Zantari watched from his seat miles above them in the sky. I wonder if they like belly rubs. Their tummies look super pattable. The sound of the door opening caused Zantari to flinch guiltily as they were ripped out of their people-watching and tummy-rubbing thoughts. Continually reminding themselves that the Terrans were sentient beings was going to be a struggle during this assignment, but a struggle that would have to wait, as the Ritilian delegate they were meeting with finally entered the room. The reptilian stood at around 5 feet tall, blue-green scales, partially covered by the yellow and green striped uniform that denoted her as a member of the diplomatic staff. She hastily took a seat amongst the off-white professional-looking furniture that denoted standard Ritilian decor, Zantari doing the same out of politeness and taking their own seat opposite the reptile. "Greetings, Ambassador Zantari. I do apologize for the delay. We weren't expecting a contact from the Gurlin, especially at such short notice. I'm Diplomat Felinia, and how can we be of aid to the Gurlin?" Zantari could tell that the Ritilian was worried. Felinia was hiding it well, but there was a small measure of nervous energy coming from the delegate. The Ritilians were generally pragmatic, and the most pragmatic thing a species could do was not angering a species far higher on the technological food chain than you were. "No worries at all. We're just doing an audit of this area of the universe and have a few questions about this grand alliance that you are a part of. Can you please explain about this Terran alliance?" Felinia was obviously confused, a curious and wary look appearing over her face as she stared back at the Gurlin. "Well, if you want to know about the alliance, there's not really much I can tell you that's not in the public records. Honestly, contacting the Terrans themselves is probably the better source of information." "All in good time. I feel that talking with the individual members gives us a better feel for the overall structure as we understand this new development. I understand that the Ritilians were the first members of the Alliance? Well, if you don't count the Hatil, which we don't since they weren't voluntary, then yes. Before it was an alliance, there were the Terrans and the Ritilians." Zantari noted a measure of pride coming from the reptilian before them, as they stated that, as if being the first was a huge honor. "So how did that happen? How did you first ally with the Terrans?" Well, it all started with the Terran invasion of Kuka. We had just started a small colony on the planet, which the Terrans attempted to also colonize without realizing we were there first. An engagement ended up happening. Officially, we don't know which side started it, although it's likely that the Terrans were the ones to start shooting first. And this invasion ended in an alliance? Well, we both realized the mistake. The Terrans didn't wish to push the issue, and we weren't going to break an unbroken egg. But then, a year later, that same colony came under attack by the Tritian AI, with no way to get our defensive forces there in time. Xantari knew of the Tritians and their now genocidal AI. They were annoyingly persistent in trying to kill all organic life, even when the Gurlin far outmatched them. As Felinia continued to speak, Xantari couldn't help but feel a bit of sympathy for the members of the Kuka colony for having to deal with that threat. The Terrans were the ones to help, successfully saving thousands of lives. They asked for nothing in return and gave up so much without being asked. Relations between our two species increased immensely since that moment. Trade deals, free movement agreements, you get the idea. And this led to the alliance? Well, the Terrans kept making new friends. The Quaxet, the Scythans, the Tluna. Eventually, the web of trade agreements and other treaties became difficult to track, so we decided to make it official after the Terrans made their 10th friend. That was interesting. Painting the Terrans as friendly, charitable philanthropists, willing to make friends with and help anyone. Honestly, it sounded sweet. A bunch of cute little primates going around the galaxy helping people. Definitely the kind of people who deserved a good head pat and some treats. I do have a question. Why did you all agree to it being called the Terran Alliance? Naming such a grand alliance after one species sounds a little arrogant. Felenia paused for a moment, as if she was trying to properly word her response. Well, it's not officially called that. Officially, it has no name. Confusion. That wasn't the answer Xantari was expecting, leaving them with one singular question. How? Well, the original plan was for each species to suggest a name. Then each of the members would vote on that name. This was a good plan, but didn't account for Terrans being... Terrans. The Terrans failed to decide amongst themselves their suggestion for a name. More confusion. How does an entire species fail to submit a name for an alliance that was presumably their idea? I ask again, how? How difficult could choosing a name be? You really haven't dealt with Terrans, have you? There are more Terran opinions than there are grains of sands on Jormungandr. Asking a group of them to decide anything is a nightmare of contradictions and disagreements. From what I understand, they are still trying to decide their submitted name 60 years later. Last time I checked, they were down to a mere 6 potential choices. That sounded absolutely adorable from the little primates. Xantari could imagine them now, arguing and being unable to work out a simple consensus for the simplest of questions, running around trying to decide amongst themselves. The Gurlin was starting to feel as if this entire endeavor had been a huge overreaction, an overabundance of caution. How could these cute little creatures who couldn't decide a name and spent their time making friends take any offense to the Gurlin? So you just called it Terran Alliance because... Well, we had to call it something, and the Terrans are the common denominator of our alliance. The name just... stuck. Just another oddity with the Terrans. There was a pause as Felinia seemed to inwardly sigh to herself at that statement. It was a small thing, hardly noticeable, but the sign of someone who had spent a lot of nights dealing with oddities. So, how has this alliance worked for the Ritilians? We Gurlin are very interested to hear how each member feels about this new alliance with the Terrans. Once again, the Ritilian diplomat took a moment to choose her words. The Gurlin were a powerful species, so it was strange seeing them taking such an interest in an alliance of species not at their technological level. Then again, what damage could being honest here actually do? Everyone knew about the Terrans, so it wasn't like she was sharing some deep, dark secret. I could describe the increase in trade and technology sharing as advantages, but I feel that would downplay how much the alliance has changed our thinking. Terrans are an impossible puzzle, as chaotic as shifting sands, never to be nailed down under one ideology or line of thinking. We've had to draft a lot of new laws, especially around setting things on fire or attaching weaponry to inanimate objects. They can be rude, overbearing, loud, impossible to predict. Felania took on a distant look for a moment, as if her bright yellow reptilian eyes were looking back at the many instances of such behaviors she'd had to deal with from the Terrans, before finishing her statement. However, they are also enthusiastic, childlike in their curiosity about the galaxy. They will bond with anyone and anything. They celebrate and uplift our culture with enthusiasm, and in turn, they change us, slowly, for the better. There are myths in our culture of helpful spirits, and that's what the Terrans are. Illogical, crazy, friendly fae. If you're ever in trouble, they'll be there, holding something that they set on fire with one hand, the other outstretched in an offer of eternal aid and friendship. The only regret the Ritilians have is that we didn't contact the Terrans sooner.